if there's enough time savings in the process that it makes sense to invest, I think that's the key point there to make sure that we're efficient.
Welcome back to the Collision Vision, driven by Auto Body News. In today's episode, we dive into the world of shop efficiency along with ADAS and alignment technology with David Henry, Senior Sales Development Manager with Hunter Engineering. Hunter is one of the most respected names in automotive service equipment, and David brings a wealth of experience in helping collision centers become more productive, more precise, and ultimately more profitable. We'll talk about how ADAS and alignment equipment play a critical role in modern day repair planning, where shops can fall short when it comes to calibration, and what smart operators are doing to tie all of this together and staying ahead. If you're looking to level up your operational game, you won't want to miss this episode. Enjoy the show. This episode is brought to you by Hunter Engineering. Are you considering getting into the ADAS calibration business? If so, consider visiting Hunter Engineering's centralized ADAS information hub learning resource and take advantage of a large library of easy-to-digest videos, insightful articles, interactive training modules, education tools, and much more, covering all aspects of the business of ADAS calibration. The ADAS calibration market is large and it's getting larger. So when you're ready to get going, your road to ADAS success begins with Hunter. Visit hunter.com/ADAS-hub to learn more. That's hunter.com/ADAS-hub. Enjoy the show. David Henry, thank you for joining us here on the Collision Vision.
Thank you so much for having me.
Looking forward to an awesome conversation. You and I are in our respective studios on a beautiful Friday, so happy to start to wind down the week on a high note. I introduced you a little bit at the top of the show. Would love to learn about you and your background in your own words as well.
Yeah, so I'm David Henry. I'm a sales development manager here in the training center at Bridgeton, Missouri, Hunter Engineering's global headquarters. Started out actually in the auto body industry as a kid, and then been running undercar stores for about 15 years before I came on board with Hunter Engineering. I've been a factory representative or a business consultant for them for about 11 years, and then moved inside to help the training department. So now I do a lot of training, corporate type training. I also do training for new business consultants, TNT reps going out in the field, and then distributor training and red carpets for key customers.
Awesome, man. Appreciate laying that foundation for us. Heck of a background. I mentioned in our pre-show conversation, been to Hunter HQ multiple times. It is an amazing facility, ton of fun stuff going on for anybody who's at all interested in that world. Want to start our conversation talking a little bit about alignments, just because as a former Hunter distributor myself, that was always a topic of conversation, collision alignments, things of that nature. Obviously, as it relates to how profitable alignments are in the service drive and in service departments, something collision centers should be considering. Why should shops rethink alignment as more than just maybe a check in the box service?
Well, I can tell you in the years that I've been doing alignments and working in that industry, it's a check in the box for the collision centers, but we can think of it as how we're going to finish up with that customer, the quality that we can quantify or make sure that customer gets when it leaves the door. With a lot of the body shops that I've dealt with in the past, I used to do alignments for them and I've sold equipment to them. They always had that as the last step. And sometimes that would delay delivery of the car. It would delay customer satisfaction. Your reviews are on your time delivered and what you can produce for your customer. One time you don't meet that deadline or what you said you were going to do because of an outside source, man, that's where it's going to really get you.
Yeah, it's a generally very profitable, if low dollar amount service, but a very profitable service for folks. And to bring that profit in-house and to make sure you have control over some of those cycle time limitations seems like it represents some opportunity. And are you seeing more and more body shops kind of taking advantage of that? Or how do you view the mix here between sublet and in-house?
Yeah, more and more the body shops are starting to look at that. Main thing is cycle times, also profitability, of course. But when we're talking about cycle times, that's what's really getting those body shops back in. They look at the time that's involved. Sometimes they're going to have to do all the body work, get the mechanical done, send it off to a alignment shop, and then might have to bring it back, do some more repairs, and then send it off again. When if they brought that in house, they might be able to do that inspection with that blueprinting of the alignment machine and make sure everything's right before they finish that job.
There you go. Why do you think shops are hesitant to look at bringing this in-house, and what are some mistakes that people make around alignment as it relates to collision?
Well, sometimes they hesitate because they don't want to take up the bay space. These shops are really busy and they have cars all over the place. They worry about the bay space and they worry about the investment. What they're giving up, is just that complete control, the quality of the work that you can produce. And that's my biggest concern with the auto body shops, not jumping into this part of the procedure. The other thing is they don't want to be behind the times. They want to make sure they have the cutting edge equipment, but when they're outsourcing it, they're relying on that shop, making sure that they're trained up to the quality standards they need to provide, which is kind of tough to hold other people to your standards.
Yeah, more and more, for better or worse, in collision repair, the word liability comes up. And the more you keep in house, the more you have control over, oftentimes, the more comfortable you can feel if you know it's getting done right. I want to kind of bring the alignment piece of our conversation to an end here by just teeing up a very general question that sort of opens up a sales pitch of why should body shops consider bringing alignment in-house. And that is, how can better alignment processes and incorporating that into your processes increase repair accuracy and reduce rework?
Okay, if we talk a little bit about Hunter Engineering, the Hawkeye Elite, there's a process we call collision blueprinting. When we go through that, and what I would recommend, that first inspection of the car, you're going to do your estimates, and then we're going to do an inspection. I would say, hey man, let's hook it up to the alignment machine, do a blueprint. What that's going to do is do a complete audit over the whole suspension and undercar of that car. It's going to check for any bent parts. It's going to look at SAI, included angles, setback, track width, body on frame. It's going to look at all those individual parts. Then you have a more wholesome picture of the repair that needs to be done. If we do that at the head part, that's going to save us a lot of time instead of sending it to a shop after we have all the things done and then finding those problems. And then the other part of it is on the backside. When we know we've got everything corrected from that blueprint and we put it on the alignment rack, we can have the best quality as possible. And when you have the equipment in your shop, you can maintain it. You can keep the specs up to date. You can make sure that it is the top quality that you're going to get. And man, most of the people I talk to in the aftermarket repair or collision centers that use outside shops, one of the things that comes to mind is, hey, do you ever take it to the shop and then have to take it back because a steering wheel's crooked? Something's not quite right. And most of the answers are, yeah, they have to do that quite often. And we think about the time involved and the steps it involves going back and forth between those shops, whether you use a rollback tow truck to commute it back and forth, or you use two of your technicians maybe to transport that car back and forth multiple times. Man, this is the time we need to jump into alignments, get those things in there so we can cut down those labor costs. Not only that, but decrease those cycle times.
This season, or series rather, is all about process optimization and efficiency. And sometimes a great way to increase both of those is bringing services that you've historically sublet in-house when it makes sense. And we'll talk a little bit about more of that later on in the conversation. Before we dive into some more general kind of operational and efficiency conversation, I'd be remiss not to touch on some ADAS calibration notes as well. I know that's a space you're intimately familiar with. We had a whole series on ADAS just a couple months ago, and the level of just change in that space and innovation in that space is staggering. What trends are you seeing out there in terms of ADAS complexity and demand across collision repair?
Well, more and more systems out there. So it's definitely getting more complex, but we got to mine it down to some more simple terms. We have cameras, we have radars, we have LiDARs, we have these systems. They're all the same systems. They might name them different. Some OEs might have 30 or 40 different names for the same systems that another OE might have 5 names for. But the truth of the matter is there's over 70 million vehicles on the road today, and that is just multiplying that have some sort of ADAS components. That means our collision centers are seeing these cars every day. And it's just something that we need to be ready for in the collision industry to make sure that we're ready to prepare those things and make sure it's safe when it leaves in the OE configuration. And then documentation is the other thing that's huge. So many places, they send it off to a second source to do that ADAS reset, and there's no documentation that it did the job right. But your name is on it. Your stamp of approval is on it when it leaves your shop.
This is one that I'm hesitant to endorse that everybody should consider taking ADAS calibration in-house. Certainly, it makes sense for a specific group of operators. Who should consider bringing ADAS calibration in-house?
Well, it's one of those things. I think if we have a certain amount of cars, we need to make sure we're looking at ADAS. The other thing is we got to think about our customers. In the collision industry, most of our customers are a couple-year-old cars. They're all having ADAS. We can always rely on, dealerships to do those resets, other collision or other ADAS reset fixtures to do those resets. But I think if you have a competent, mechanical person in your shop and you have the aptitude to get it done, I think you should jump into ADAS in your shop and maybe you tiptoe into it, maybe just doing some dynamic resets to start with and then jump into the static. But I think there's a place at the table for almost every shop, maybe not everyone. If you're a really low volume or, we got to say it, some of these smaller towns, maybe we don't see as many late model cars, but we still need to make sure these customers are in good shape.
Yeah, it's almost to the point where some crazy high percentage of vehicles are going to need some sort of ADAS calibration. Question is really around A, ROI, B, kind of facility requirements. What are we seeing today in terms of any evolution as to what kind of space and setting is required to properly calibrate a vehicle?
There's definitely been a big change. We look at all the resets that are done, and there's a huge space needed for a majority of those resets, but there's very few percentage of those need reset most of the time. And then not only that, but we can get creative on where we place the vehicle so we can get around that. There's a lot of misconception on the OE says I need this much space when in reality, you don't need that much space if you move your car to the other side of the base. So what's going on is we're getting a lot more creative with how we're doing these resets and how we're placing it. The other hurdle we had in the past was, we had to have a perfectly level concrete slab. We had to have a perfectly clean or stale environment for these resets. But we found out that, with some of the tools that we're having now and some of the complex measurements we can do, we can make adjustments for uneven floors. We find the live plane of the car. We can make sure we're setting those targets properly without that pristine environment.
That is quite the change, right? And it makes sense, right? As vehicles are going to advance technologically, the equipment that services those vehicles will as well. So it's heartening to hear that we're keeping up, and no question, if anyone's going to do it, it's going to be you guys. We talked about, or at least touched on, process planning as it relates to alignment. Certainly, that comes into play as it relates to ADAS calibration as well. What role, in your opinion, does process planning play in reducing these kind of ADAS related cycle time delays?
Oh yeah, processes are huge, especially in ADAS. We think about the way these systems are reset, and sometimes it's just the placement of the sensor inside of the bumper and making sure it's placed properly. But if we had the tool in house, we think about this process when we set that out in front. We have the tool in house. We can tell you if that sensor is not accurately placed. At that point, you need to dive in and check out that bracket, the radiator support, or something that maybe wasn't even damaged in the collision, but you had to pull it off for the repair and then put it back on. Sometimes that is going to skew where that placement is, and you might need to make an adjustment. So if we build this in our process where after we do those body repairs, we replace the bumper, the radiator support, whatever, or pull that off to replace something else and put it back, we start into this process. We can see that we're going to have a problem or calibrate it right off the bat instead of having to do it, let's say, reactively. We can be proactive with that process.
So I could have an entire conversation with you around equipment and ADAS and alignment. I'm kind of a nerd in that area, but I do want to move on and go ahead and get into some actionable insights from an operational and kind of lean capacity. What are, from your perspective, some overlooked areas where shops are losing time or losing margin that could be corrected with some simple changes?
Well, in the collision industry, we kind of hit on it, those pre-alignment checks, those ADAS resets, those things that we can bring in house. If we think about a process, when we go out there and we look at the vehicle, we look at doing our estimate on the vehicle, we can only go so far without pulling some stuff apart. If we can streamline that process, streamline the inspection process where we get a little deeper look by doing blueprinting on it or any other internal inspection, to make sure that we're nailing all the parts the first time. You know, I don't know if you see the same thing I see, but a lot of times these collision repair shops, it's not that they're not doing the right job, but they just don't know until they pull the car apart exactly what's going on. If we can get a clearer picture of that inspection, that plan, by doing a blueprint alignment or checking it in depth, on an alignment rack, get underneath it. I think that would really streamline that process. The biggest thing is flow through, the most productive shops I know, they really have a system on how to work it through. They know where the car is at each stage, and it progresses through that stage, and it knows when it's at, the third stage, it's doing the third part of the process. I think preparation and planning, processes is a big part of it. That's my big thing is processes, the less amount of steps to get the same job done, we're going to be better at it.
Keep it simple, right?
That's right.
And slow down to speed up, work smarter, not harder. There's a whole lot that kind of these statements that ring very true. It makes some sense to really make sure you're planning appropriately, executing properly, and it can save a lot of time and effort and increase those margins. When
Exactly.
when considering kind of keeping up in the future, I have been giving a talk about how the single shop, generalist body shop, that era is becoming more and more challenging, and vehicles are getting difficult to fix. There's an ROI calculation that has to be made to determine whether it makes sense to keep up with what's going on or go ahead and get out or figure out how to do it differently. A big piece of that is equipment, right? To keep up with these vehicles, you have to continuously invest in equipment. How do you recommend shops evaluate whether they're using the equipment they have today to its full potential before pulling the trigger on maybe some upgrades or replacements?
Well, the key point is making sure that they have optimized that equipment. If they're using it to its full, let's say, potential. You mentioned that. How do we validate that? Equipment, when we look at updating equipment or increasing, the equipment we have in our shop, we got to see if it's going to increase our productivity, our throughput, and if there's enough time savings in the process that it makes sense to invest. I think that's the key point there, to make sure that we're efficient. If we're seeing that we have a bottleneck or a slowdown in a certain process, let's look into that process and see if there's something that we can do, with technology, with equipment that might streamline that process. Maybe it's making it easier to use. Maybe it's just a more effective way to do the same job. We think about these OE compliance and some of the stuff that they have, to work on the aluminum bodies, the new polymers, some of that stuff. Unfortunately, some of that equipment you just need to get. You might have to validate that by how many of that OE you see, but let's look at our equipment. And if we see a bottleneck in that particular part of our process, or our walkthrough, then maybe that's where we need to focus on that attention.
No question. And any recommendations for calculating that ROI? I know Hunter's been pretty good about at least painting a picture on collision alignments. I'm sure there's data on ADAS as well. For those on the fence, maybe even considering getting out because it is getting expensive and challenging to fix these vehicles. How do you help guide potential customers in that equation?
Yeah, our business consultants out there in the field, they can do ROIs pretty easily for you. The big thing is to look at the big picture. The average ADAS reset is about $240. If we look in the past, that used to be a couple hour procedure, but with some of the new technology we have out, that target placements can be done in a matter of minutes, and then the reset. So if we really think about it, if we're doing, say 3, 4 ADAS resets a week, we probably need to look at getting into the business.
Makes sense to me. I know something that Hunter has historically been very good at is customer testimonials. So I hope I'm not putting you in the spot here, but any success stories where you've seen shops improve their KPIs or their performance by rethinking alignment or ADAS and bringing these things in house and really getting it dialed in?
Well, yeah, I had a I'm from Arizona. That was the last state I was in before I came inside. And I had a big body shop, very productive. So they had a lot of cars coming in and out, and they were right in the middle of all the dealerships. So they were doing a lot of the dealership services. And then when it came to alignments, they would ship it to that OE or to that dealership to do the alignment and then bring it back in house. So about 6 years ago, we invested in an alignment machine and rack just to smooth his process and eliminate that hitch or that hiccup in his process. It was kind of crazy. About 2.5, 3 years ago, he wanted to investigate an ADAS because he saw the same bottleneck he had before. And yeah, everything lined up and we got him into ultimate ADAS. I said, man, what are you going to do with your alignment machine? He's going to put it in one of his slower shops and start boosting that process in that shop. And now he's doing alignments and ADAS with the same machine. He told me he paid off that alignment machine in a matter of months, not even years, in a matter of months. So he had no problem investing in ultimate ADAS where he can do alignments and ADAS with the same machine. It was pretty cool. Yeah, he's downtown Glendale, right in the middle of the auto body dealerships there. And it was just an amazing turnaround when he got into alignments and now into ADAS. It's pretty amazing. If you go to Hunter YouTube channel, you'll see some more testimonials about body shops investing in this equipment and how it can really turn their business around.
Awesome. Now, it's a great story. If you have any links you'd like to share of those videos or specific videos, would be happy to include those in the show notes for folks as well. If somebody's listening to our conversation today, they're interested in learning more about processes and optimizing what they're doing and investing in their business. So for shops who say, hey, I know I need to keep up. I know I might be a little bit behind on that front. What's a simple first step to go ahead and get some of their processes under control and increase their operational efficiencies?
Well, there's two really easy ways. The first one is you can look up hunter.com, type in your zip code and call your BC or your business consultant that covers your store. Have him come down, have him talk through some processes with you that might help out the efficiency. The other thing I'm going to say is, man, if you go to hunter.com, the first splash is going to be ADAS portal. If you go to that portal, there's actually a tab for collision centers, and it's going to talk over the different processes that are going to help the collision centers be more profitable and more proactive on these resets, and really grab the bull by the horns and making sure we're prepared for the cars, not only that are in our shop today that we might be subbing out, but the ones that are coming in tomorrow.
I want to double click on something you said a few minutes back, and it was some of these shops having uniquely good and well mapped out processes and procedures. How does one go about starting to do that internally? Kind of our equipment conversation aside, how does somebody get to feel like they have a really good process and procedure plan in place?
Man, I think you need to break it down into simple steps. You know, I do several competitive sports and stuff like that, and it's all breaking down into palatable steps. We know how we need to get this job done, right? And if we break that down into the steps that it's going to take to accomplish the task. So each step has a unique path. And if we take and look at that or diagram that out so we can see it all in one holistic picture, and then we can find out in each one of those steps what we need to do to be more efficient, whether it's, prepping the car for paint, maybe it's disassembling the car for inspection. If we look at each step as, we need to do A before we can do B, we can find ways to limit the process or limit the steps in between process where we're not having to backtrack. I think really if we get that holistic view, step back and see our business, they're going to know their business better than I'm going to know their business. I've been out of the auto body industry for quite a while, but what I do is I look at stuff and I see what is the fastest process and how can I get through there this most seamlessly way possible. And I think if we do that in the collision center or that collision segment, it's going to be the same way. We're going to look at, hey, how we're going to receive the customer, how we're going to build the inspection or the quote for the customer. And then once we get that, how are we going to take that thing home? Each step. And if we look at each step and we break that down and really model it down to how to be the most efficient. And sometimes it's stocking more fasteners. Maybe it's, making sure we have the right guys at the right time when that car needs a certain process. Um, I don't know how we can mine it down to each individual shop, but I say look at everything as a process, break those processes down into palatable steps, and then just refine them. Find everything that'll make you better. I don't know about you, but when I was running shops, man, I had an employee that I was doing a brake job with, and I said, "Hey, is that the best brake job you've ever done?" He says, "No, what do you mean?" I said, "Just find one way, constant improvement." I said, "Find one way that would make it better for the customer, make it better for you, the quality of the brake job. It takes as long as it takes to get it right, but if we refine these steps, we can get it right faster every time."
It's something that there are so many operators across our industry that have gotten that stuff dialed in, and it
Yeah.
separates the good from the great. And I was speaking with some groups in the general service and mechanical space over the past couple weeks, and they were in awe of how body shop operators can make as much money as they do based on the limitations they have in place in terms of labor rates and things like that compared to tire and service. And they credited that for this efficiency. And they said, man, if we could be as efficient as body shop operators are, imagine the margins we would make because our labor rates are much higher. And so, I mean, we have a good reputation as an industry about being pretty efficient and process oriented. But man, I know we can do a whole lot better. Going back,
Yeah.
we sort of touched on this, but I think it's worth driving home a little bit.
Mhm.
How can shops quantitatively as possible measure whether it's time to invest in new equipment or optimize the workflow around what they already have?
Yeah. You know, my biggest thing is if we have that, we talked about it before, the bottleneck, there's only so much you can do to work around that. That's where we know we need to explore new equipment that's going to make it more feasible or faster, or open that up. Sometimes it's our equipment is producing just as much as it can. We just need to maybe double the equipment, maybe update the equipment. There's so many parameters out there, but when we look at that process, we break it down into the process and we see that we have, let's say, a paint booth. We're getting the body work done efficiently. We're getting everything done until we get to the paint booth, and then it slows down because we have one paint booth. Well, we got to think about that. We can update the paint booth. Is that going to make us paint faster? Maybe not. Maybe we need a second paint booth or a second shift of painters. Same thing goes with the other equipment we're talking about. If there's a bottleneck in your process and it is slowing down the through point, I think that's where we need to pay attention. And whether that's alignment equipment, ADAS equipment, where you might be shipping it or outsourcing it out, and that's a bottleneck, or some other part of your business. Let's find those hiccups or those bottlenecks, and we can work through it to make sure we increase that productivity.
Well said. And you gave us a little bit of insight around what these business consultants via Hunter have going on and have to offer across the country. But want to ask you directly, what types of support can folks expect in terms of training and process from Hunter as it relates to everything we've talked about today?
Well, that's a cool thing about Hunter Engineering. When you buy a piece of Hunter equipment, you don't buy just a piece of equipment, but you buy a team. You're going to get a service rep that's going to install everything and train you on it. You have a business consultant that's going to help you implement that into your business. And then we have regional training centers that offer training on all the equipment we sell, whether it's ADAS, alignments, tire and wheel service. We're going to have in-depth training there. It's pretty amazing that Hunter is in the forefront of training. We also have something that's free to all of our customers or anybody in the automotive industry, our LMS. If you go to hunter.com and go to training, you can go to our LMS or our learning management system. And it's an online or an e-learning system that's free to everybody. And you can build a transcript on there and take it to your next location. But know that Hunter, because we provide such robust training, not only in person, but online, and then the team that's there in the field that are going to help you every day. You give them a call, somebody's going to be there, usually within the same day, if not the next day, to make sure you have that support. Whether it's ADAS support, alignment support, or anything else Hunter provides. Just know, Hunter and Hunter Training is here to really promote not only undercar, but the whole automotive industry, and make sure we're ready to attack the future, not the past.
Man, you've been so generous with your time and given out some great insights to folks here today. I want to ask you kind of one more question before we wrap up and gets a little heady. Let's do some thinking here together. But if you had one mindset shift that you could recommend to shop leaders across the country to improve their efficiency, what would that shift be?
Man, I think we just need to open our mind, and then listen to other ideas. I don't know about you, but when we're growing, when we're learning, it's listening to those other shops and learning other processes and maybe implement them, maybe not, but putting them in your toolbox, and don't be afraid to change and try something new. It's the greats that have always pushed themselves to the limit and found that limit and backed off just a hair, or get advice from everyone, put it in their toolbox, and then when they need it, hey, guess what? You can pull it out. Be a continued learner. Make sure that you're always pushing the boundaries and testing new procedures and processes just to make sure you're better every day.
Man, that's great stuff. It's great advice. There are greats right now operating in this industry, and there's something to be learned from every operator out there. Something that I've been inspired by in this industry is how willing thought leaders are to go ahead and share and put things out there. We're not viewing ourselves as competitors. We're not afraid to give out insights and advice. And David, you are one such thought leader today. So appreciative of your time and the insights you've been willing to share and give out to our listeners. Where can people get in touch with you if they want to connect or learn more about everything you offer?
Hey, it's pretty easy. Just go to hunter.com and then hit the training department. You'll see all the contacts, anything to get a hold of us as Hunter Engineering Training Department. Make sure you log on to the LMS. You'll see a lot of videos on there that I produce, just helping out processes and procedures. Man, go to SEMA.
Always
NADA.
great advice.
Oh man, I've been presented at SEMA for the last almost 11 years. CES, NADA. Look for our booths and come in and shake our hand and ask us questions. We're there to help out the environment. The whole automotive industry. Really, we want to make sure that everyone has the right tools, but not only that, but spreads the knowledge to make sure that we're all elevated.
Well, you've certainly helped do that here today. David, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us on the Collision Vision.
Thank you so much, and it was a great time. Feel free to reach out anytime, Cole.
That is all for today's episode here on the Collision Vision. Thank you again to David Henry and the entire team over at Hunter Engineering for joining us today. From smarter alignment processes to best practices in ADAS calibration, today's conversation was packed with real-world actionable insights to help you run a more efficient shop. If you enjoyed this episode of the Collision Vision, or you're enjoying any of our episodes, please be sure to hit that subscribe button wherever you enjoy your podcast. And do me a favor, go ahead and leave me a review here on the Collision Vision and give us a share with some of your friends who might find this type of content insightful and helpful in their business. Stay tuned for more great conversations here on the Collision Vision. And as always, on behalf of the Auto Body News team and myself, thank you for coming along for the ride.